So this is chapter 6. And the proverb at the beginning is, adversity is the foundation of virtue. Adversity means challenge, and virtue usually means like a goodness that one has. So challenge is what leads to goodness, maybe. And this is from Aki's perspective. And now she's in Poston, Arizona. So she's at the camp. Aki and her mother crowded onto the bus filled with other families riding to Poston from the train station. Most people were dressed in their best clothes, men in suits and fedoras, women in dresses with gloves and small hats that matched their overcoats. Children stood hand in hand with their parents, everyone somber and quiet. That makes me think of when we were reading about Blue Eagle, when he went to the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. Remember how they left home and they put on their best clothes so that they would make a good impression when they arrived. And then once they got there, they had to throw all their clothes away and they were told their clothes weren't good enough. On the bus ride, Aki took in the landscape. On either side of the road, she saw nothing but desert, miles and miles of flat, dry dirt. Off in the distance, rugged purple mountains cut a jagged line along the horizon and looked just as unfriendly and desolate as the desert. This is a lonely, awful place, Aki decided. She shifted closer to her mother on the seat beside her. Have you heard from Pop? Aki asked. Not yet, her mother responded. The post office isn't open yet. Soon I know it will. Soon. I know it will be soon. Sorry. As the bus approached, Aki saw what looked like an army barracks surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Barracks are the places where people stay in the military, so kind of like big rows of bunk houses. Where are we? Aki asked. The Sonoran Desert, her mother said, Poston. Aki felt relieved that her mother didn't say home. A uniformed soldier stood outside the front gate. He didn't carry a rifle, but he didn't need to. Even if we did escape, where would we go? The tiny blades of the barbed wire fence glinted like silver shark's teeth in the sunlight. Her mother whispered, whatever you do, don't go near that fence. Kind of like the fence around the school. As they climbed off the bus, they were herded by guards through an administration building. When they exited on the other side, they were in Poston. Aki tried to get her bearings. It wasn't easy because everything looked the same, row after row of slapped together wood and tar paper structures resting on concrete bases. There were no trees or grass, just dust and dirt. They turned right, walked halfway down the street, and stopped in front of a house that was about 100 feet long by 20 feet wide, with 4 entrances. There are 4 rooms inside, her mother said, for 4 families. 4 families live here in this little space? Come inside, her mother said. Aki climbed several wooden steps and entered a stuffy room furnished with steel-framed army cots, a table, chairs, a broom, a pot-bellied stove. Pot-bellied stove means one of those old-fashioned kind of black metal stoves where you light the fire on the inside and you can cook on top of it. And a coal bucket. Gray wool army blankets lay neatly folded at the foot of each bed. Aki counted 3 beds, for Seiko, her mother, and her. We'll need another bed for Pop when he comes back to us, she thought. More wool blankets hung from the ceiling, dividing the space into sections. 1 for each family. There were no real interior walls. So this is the new place that she's been sent to live, right? They pulled them out of their homes and sent them there. And it's one big, long building, and there aren't walls separating it. They just hung up a blanket across to make different compartments so that multiple families could live there. And this is what it was really like. This really happened. The Japanese Americans really were sent to live in these camps. Where's Seiko? Aki asked. He's working, her mother replied. He got a job as a carpenter. He's getting paid, and it gives him something to do. Aki placed her suitcase next to one of the beds. She looked around the room and drew a deep breath. She didn't want to unpack her things. She wasn't ready to admit that this was to be her home. Not yet. Could we go for a walk? Aki asked. Look around? Of course, her mother said. Sunshine will do you good. A gray-haired woman with a straw broom was sweeping the next doorstep. Good afternoon, Aki, Aki's mother said. This is my daughter, Aki, the one we've been waiting for. She turned to Aki. This is Mrs. Fujioka. She is from Sacramento. Her daughter and grandson live here too. Aki nodded. Pleased to meet you. Mrs. Fujioka smiled. Welcome. Aki followed her mother on a tour of the residential blocks, the school, the administration buildings, and the canteen. Each building looked just like the next. Will I ever be able to find my way around without a guide? She wondered. As they walked, Aki looked for Yuki's face. Have you seen my roommate from the hospital? She's here now too. Oh, honey, her mother said, this is a big place. There are thousands of people in 3 separate camps. You'll make lots of friends. Excuse me. They stopped by the latrine. Latrine is another word for bathroom. Aki stepped inside and saw to her horror that the bathroom was an open room. There was a raised platform in the middle with 6 holes and no walls, no privacy. When they were back outside, Aki said, I don't like the bathroom. I know, her mother said. I don't either. Aki's mother pointed up to the building ahead. Now I will show you the mess hall. Mess hall? Aki asked. The cafeteria, her mother said, the place where we eat. Outside the mess hall, Aki spotted Seiko, who was waiting for them. He looked older. Aki squinted and just for a moment imagined that he was her father. Seiko threw his arms around Aki and lifted her right up off the ground. Welcome home, little sister. Aki didn't like what she heard. How could this hot, dusty, cramped place without Pop ever be home? But she just smiled and hugged him back. Together, the 3 of them entered the mess hall and lined up for dinner. Some people stood in a long line waiting for food. Others sat at rows of picnic tables eating their meals. Every face she saw was Japanese. The infant smearing food across his face. The elderly woman wiping the corner of her mouth with a napkin. The teenage girl whispering to her laughing sister. The child sopping up a glass of spilled milk. The mother cutting her daughter's food. And the father scolding his crying son. So many people, she said. They're from all over. Fresno, Monterey Bay, Sacramento, Seiko told his sister. You'll get used to the noise. They collected their food on battered meal trays, then sat together at the end of a table. What is this? Aki asked, looking cautiously at the toast topped with flakes of dried beef in white sauce. They call it chipped beef, her mother replied, unfolding a napkin in her lap. Get used to it, kid, Seiko said. We have it a lot. This is making me think about just different times where kind of you just get what you get to eat, right? You don't get to choose. You're not choosing between the pizza and the hamburger or whatever. You're just, this is what they made for everybody. It's what you get to eat. And it's not like they can go somewhere else to get some more food. Aki took a couple of bites. The salty beef and thick white sauce felt heavy in her stomach. She wasn't used to eating such rich food. She longed for her mother's harusame noodle salad and steamed rice. Sounds good. After dinner, they returned to their unfamiliar room and Aki's mother helped her put away her things. She handed Aki a glass and motioned to a bucket near the door. If you're thirsty in the night, this water is for drinking. So that means no sinks or anything. They just have a bucket of water in their little blanket room. Later, when it was time to change her clothes, Aki stood in a corner, her back toward the center of the room. Seiko and her mother looked away. Without removing her dress, Aki pulled her nightgown on over her head. Hidden by her sleepwear, she unbuttoned her dress, wriggled free, and then slipped her arms into the sleeves of her gown. Although her body was covered the whole time, Aki felt her face redden, embarrassed by the lack of privacy. Lack means not having, so a lack of privacy means she doesn't have privacy. Aki looked at the beds. Would it be okay if we moved ours closer together? Kudasai, please? Of course, her mother said. I would like that too. Aki pushed her narrow cot to her mother's, close enough that they could reach over and hold hands in the darkness. Mom, Aki pulled the sheet over her chest. She kept her voice low and tried not to listen to the whispers coming from behind the blanket walls all around her. I miss Pop. Her mother brushed the hair from Aki's face. I do too. I don't like the food, but the rest isn't so bad. The beginning is easy, said her mother. The continuing is hard. I wonder why that is. I wonder why she says the beginning is easy, but the continuing is hard. It doesn't sound like the beginning is easy to me, so I can only imagine that it's getting harder. Although it was not yet summer, at lunch, time passed. There was a little squiggle thing that means time passed. Although it was not yet summer, at lunch she overheard one of her neighbors say that the temperature outside was more than 100 degrees. That's nothing, Seiko said. I've been told that the highs around here can reach 115 degrees or more in the summer. Aki wanted to think he was kidding, but she knew he wasn't. The government calls Poston's 3 camps Poston 1, 2, and 3, her brother said. We call them Roastin', Toastin', and Dustin'. She wanted to laugh, but it was too hot even for that. When they got back to the room, Aki sat in the doorway and fanned herself with a copy of the Poston Chronicle, the camp newspaper written by the internees. Internees are the people who live there. So that suffix EES, ease. Think about the word employ, which means to hire somebody. Employer is the person who hires people, and employee is the person who was hired. So an internee is the person who was interned or brought into this camp. Seiko and their mother stood outside, chatting with Mrs. Fujioka. Out of the corner of her eye, Aki thought she saw something moving inside the room. She turned around and saw a large black snake slithering up through a gap in the floorboards. So like the floorboards, that's like the wood on the ground, and so there's a gap in between them, and the snake is coming up from the floor. Seiko, she shouted, a snake! In what seemed like one swift movement, Seiko grabbed a metal shovel next to the coal bucket and smashed the snake until it looked like a flattened, rotten banana. Gross. When it stopped moving, he scooped it up and took it outside. When he returned, Aki's heart was still racing. She smiled at her brother with admiration. What's a snake doing here? She asked. He lives here, Seiko said. We're the ones who don't belong. Aki knew he was right. She and her family belonged at their farm in Westminster. She belonged in her room, on her bed, under her yellow cotton bedspread. She thought about the Mexican family that her mother said had leased the farm. Would another girl be living in her room, sleeping in her bed, going to her school? I want to go home. And that's the end of the chapter. And we know the answers to some of those questions, right? Because Sylvia is now living in her room, sleeping in her bed, but not going to her school because she wasn't allowed to. When you get a chance, go ahead and log into the class spreadsheet, the Sylvia and Aki response spreadsheet, and record a comment or a question you have. One thing to think about is if you were in Aki's shoes, if you were in her position and your family after World War II got sent to this camp, how do you think you would be feeling? Would you be nervous? Would you be angry? Would you be sad? Would you be confused? How would you feel? You don't have to respond to that one. You can just share a comment or a question. But if you're stuck on what to share, answer that question on the spreadsheet. Okay.